Okay, let's unpack this stack of sources on the diverse perspectives on the state. We have a fascinating collection here, looking at how different political thinkers throughout history have um, fundamentally understood what the state is and what its purpose might be.
Right.
Think of this as your shortcut to getting a clear, well-informed handle on these fundamental political theories that still shape our world.
That's right. And these sources provide a really wide range of views. I mean, from ancient philosophical ideas right through to very modern critiques.
Yeah.
We'll explore how thinkers have seen the state perhaps as an organism, maybe a machine, an instrument of a class, a community, and a few other fascinating angles too.
And our mission for this deep dive is, well, to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this material. We want to break down these complex ideas into understandable concepts, highlighting their core arguments, where they came from, and the key criticisms leveled against them.
It's not just about summarizing old ideas, though, is it?
No, exactly.
We'll connect the dots, look at some maybe surprising facts, and explore what these different views mean for our understanding of power, freedom, and how society is organized.
Exactly. These historical theories aren't just dusty concepts. They truly underpin our modern political systems, our ongoing debates about rights, freedom, and even the role of government in your own life.
Right.
Why should you care about old theories of the state? Because they are the foundations upon which the present is built. And understanding them is really key to understanding the forces that structure the world around you.
So what does all this mean for how you understand the world around you? Let's find out.
Okay, so our first perspective takes us way back.
Hmm.
It offers perhaps one of the most intuitive ways people might think about a large collective body like the state.
Hmm.
The idea of the state as an organism.
This is the organic theory. Yeah.
Yeah.
At its most basic, it draws a comparison between the state and a living organism, like, say, a plant or a human body.
Right.
And individuals are seen as its various parts or organs.
Okay, let's unpack that comparison.
Mhm.
What are the big implications if you view the state like a body and people like organs?
Well, the core nugget here is that the state is primary. Individuals find their purpose, even their very existence, within the state.
Ah,
Just as, a hand or a heart depends entirely on the body for its life and function. An organ separate from the body isn't really a hand or heart anymore, is it? It's just tissue.
right.
So in this view, an individual separate from the state lacks meaning or completeness.
So you're not seen as a complete independent entity on your own.
Not really, no. The state is the whole, the greater entity.
Hmm.
And a second implication, which is pretty significant, is that just as different organs have different functions and positions, the theory suggests different groups or classes within society are naturally suited for different roles.
Okay.
Some potentially in more vital or superior positions than others, but all supposedly working together for the good of the whole organism and the state.
That definitely sounds like it could easily justify social hierarchies or even a rigid class structure, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. It provides a sort of natural basis for it. And you see hints of this idea very early on in political thought.
Like with the Greeks.
Exactly. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, saw the state as a natural institution, almost like a family or village just scaling up.
Right.
He famously argued that he who is unable to live in society, or has no need because he is sufficient unto himself, must be either a beast or a god. He thought the state came into being for the sake of life, but continued existing for the sake of the good life,
Okay.
implying it was essential for human flourishing.
So it's seen as natural and necessary for living well.
Yes, in that early view. Now, this idea was somewhat overshadowed for a while, particularly with the rise of more mechanistic views in the 17th century, which we'll definitely get to later.
Right.
But it saw a strong revival in the late 18th and 19th centuries.
Why then? What brought it back?
Well, partly it was a reaction against those mechanistic, sort of atomistic views that saw individuals as disconnected pieces. People were looking for something that felt more connected, more organic.
And perhaps even more importantly, the rise of powerful nationalism gave this theory a huge boost.
Ah, yeah, that makes sense.
It allowed the state to be portrayed as the embodiment of the nation, something almost sacred, something to which individuals owed total devotion.
Okay, nationalism as a driving force for this organic view. Who are some key figures in this revival?
Well, Edmund Burke, often seen as a chief exponent of conservatism, used organic analogies quite a bit.
Ray Burke.
He viewed the state not as something constructed overnight, but as a product of long historical growth, like an organism. complex, delicate, greater than the sum of its parts, arguing it couldn't survive being, dissected or fundamentally altered too quickly.
And the German idealist philosopher Hegel is a major figure too, right? He comes up a lot here.
Absolutely. G.W.F. Hegel's idealist theory took this idea to a highly philosophical level. He saw the state as the embodiment of the rational, spiritual will of the nation, almost an object of worship.
He had that incredibly powerful, almost divine quote, "State is march of God on earth." That really emphasizes the ultimate, almost sacred significance the state held in his philosophy.
March of God on earth. That's quite a statement, elevating the state to the highest possible level.
Indeed. And then in the 19th century, the burgeoning science of biology and the theory of evolution gave this organic analogy new sort of scientific-seeming legitimacy.
Oh, okay.
The biological school of political thinkers really leaned into it. They likened state development to biological evolution, seeing increasing differentiation of parts and functions as a sign of advancement.
I remember the sources mentioning they got quite detailed, even using terms like tissues of the state and analogies to bodily systems.
Oh, yes, they really stretched the metaphor, drew parallels to systems of nutrition, circulation, specific organs like the brain, heart. And there's a rather specific and memorable detail from this school, from Blunchley, who went so far as to liken the state to a masculine entity and the church to a feminine one.
Okay, a masculine state and feminine church. That is specific and quite a projection of, well, contemporary gender roles onto institutions.
It certainly stands out, doesn't it? But beyond the biological comparisons, this perspective also emphasizes the state as an ethical institution.
Right, the idea that it's essential for leading a good life.
Exactly. The belief is that by being a citizen, participating in the life of the state, performing your duties, exercising your rights within the state, you develop your moral character and achieve moral excellence.
Okay.
This ethical role, again, often rests on the idea of differentiated functions and capabilities, echoing back to Aristotle's views on natural differences.
And this is where some of the more, so to say, problematic aspects come in, like justifying slavery.
Yes, unfortunately, that's a historical application of this idea. Aristotle, as cited, clearly stated, "From the hour of birth, some men are marked out for subjection and others for rule." He used this notion of natural difference to defend slavery, arguing it secured a good life for both masters, who could preserve virtue through leisure, and slaves, who supposedly benefited from exposure to their master's virtue. It was justified as natural based on inherent unequal capabilities.
That's a really important and disturbing historical context for these ideas.
It really highlights how powerful analogies can be, how they can be used to justify existing power structures. Now, the biological school, as we touched on, detailed specific characteristics they saw the state sharing with an organism.
Let's quickly highlight those three from the source. What were they?
Okay, first, the intrinsic relationship between parts and the whole. Unlike a machine where a part removed is still the part, like a wheel is still a wheel off the car, an organ removed from a body loses its essential character and function.
Right.
Second, organic unity and growth from within. Organisms develop gradually. You can't just swap parts in and out like a machine.
Makes sense.
And third, an organism exists as an end in itself, not merely a means to some external goal, which they then applied to the state.
And they claimed the state possessed these qualities, making it the real source of good life, appealing to man's rational nature.
Yes, exactly. And this led to those various terms you see, like moral organism, superorganism, even things like real person or superperson, giving the state this distinct identity above and beyond the individuals who make it up.
Which brings us back to the implications for individuals. If the state is this superorganism and you're just a part,
then your interests, according to this theory, can't really be distinguished from the interest of the state. Just like a kidney or a finger doesn't have interests separate from the body's overall well-being. And this leads to a critical point. Individuals have rights within the state, rights defined and granted by the state, but they have no inherent rights against the state.
That sounds fundamentally concerning for individual liberty and autonomy.
It is, yeah. In this perspective, true freedom is often defined simply as obedience to the laws and will of the state.
To obey.
Essentially, by aligning yourself with the greater good of the organism, you achieve your highest potential. That's the idea.
Okay, so that's the essence of the organic theory. State as a natural ethical organism, individuals as subservient parts, inherent hierarchy, freedom basically boiling down to obedience. But the sources also lay out significant criticisms of this view. What are the key weaknesses highlighted?
The criticisms are quite pointed, yeah. The most significant one, arguably, is the subordination of man.
Okay.
In this view, the individual is overshadowed, almost completely submerged within the state's personality and goals. You're not seen as an independent, positive actor capable of pursuing your own conception of the good or acting on individual conscience, especially if it conflicts with the state's perceived needs. You're sort of passive, just fulfilling a predetermined function.
So no real room for dissent or individual conscience or acting outside your prescribed role?
Not easily accommodated, no, not in the pure form of the theory. A second crucial criticism points to the gap between the ideal versus actual state.
The difference between the theory and reality.
Exactly. The theory often visualizes this wise, benevolent, unified state acting for the ultimate good. But in reality, the state is administered by imperfect human beings, legislators, ministers, judges, bureaucrats, military leaders.
And these are people who can be flawed, selfish, make mistakes, or have narrow interests like anyone.
Precisely. The criticism is if you grant absolute authority to this theoretical ideal state, in practice you're granting it to fallible human officials and demanding total sacrifice in the state's name when it's run by such officials, well, that can lead to disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
The sources explicitly cite the Nazi and fascist regimes between the world wars as terrifying historical examples where this elevation of the state above the individual and above critique led to immense suffering and destruction.
That links directly to the third and perhaps most potent criticism, the inherent risk of totalitarianism.
Absolutely. By reducing liberty to mere obedience and removing any concept of individual rights against the state, the theory leaves no effective safeguards for liberty. The source quotes R.M. McClover directly on this danger. If we do not distinguish society from the state, we are on the dangerous road to totalitarianism.
Wow.
He starkly connects this philosophical path, traced through thinkers who elevated the state's will, like Rousseau's idea of forcing men to be free, Fichte and Hegel, to the real-world outcomes under fascism and Nazism, leading, as he put it, to the concentration camp and the death of the creative spirit.
A very powerful condemnation showing the real-world stakes of these seemingly abstract ideas.
It really underscores the potential for immense harm when state authority is seen as absolute and unaccountable to individuals. Then the fourth key criticism is the denial of equality.
This seems directly tied to that idea of natural hierarchy we discussed earlier, doesn't it?
It is, yeah. The theory is fundamentally undemocratic. The organism analogy implies a fixed structure. Toes don't get to tell the brain what to do. This translates into the idea that ordinary people cannot or should not have an equal say. Wisdom and authority become the monopoly of a chosen few, alienating the masses from decision-making processes.
The source describes this as a clever device to preserve the inequality of status and opportunity on the pretext of supposed ethical principles.
Yes, it can be used to provide a philosophical justification for existing injustices like slavery, racial supremacy, imperialism, economic exploitation, by claiming these unequal positions are natural or ethical for the good of the whole. The sources counter this forcefully, stating there is no scientific evidence for fundamental, inherent differences in people's potential or excellence. They argue that the differences we observe are largely a product of the socio-economic system, education, opportunities, healthcare, participation factors shaped by society and the state, not inherent nature.
So the supposed natural differences are often consequences of social structures, not their justification. That wraps up our look at the organic theory and its significant, even dangerous criticisms. Now let's pivot to a perspective that arose, in part, as a direct challenge to this view.
Okay, that would be the liberal individualist perspective, often characterized by the state as a machine metaphor. It offers a completely different starting point.
A machine. That's a total departure from a living organism. What's the core idea here?
Instead of seeing the state as something natural that grows organically, this view sees it as an artificial contrivance, a mechanism deliberately created by human beings for specific purposes.
Okay.
Both society and the state are often understood through mechanistic analogies governed by discoverable laws, much like the physical universe was increasingly seen in the scientific revolution.
Where did this very different idea come from historically?
It gained prominence starting in the 17th century, closely tied to the scientific revolution. As thinkers like Newton described the physical world operating like a giant clockwork machine governed by predictable laws,
Right.
it seemed logical to apply similar rational, mechanistic thinking to human society and political structures.
And who found this perspective particularly appealing? Was there a certain group?
It strongly suited the interests of the emerging middle-class merchants, manufacturers, those involved in the new forms of trade and industry.
Ah, okay.
They favored a view of society based on contract and reason, not tradition or inherited status. And they particularly wanted minimal interference from the state in economic activities, aligning with the idea of a free market machine that worked best when left alone.
So the rise of capitalism really went hand in hand with this view.
Absolutely. It was heavily strengthened by the rise of social contract theory, which explicitly sees the state as founded on human agreement and laissez-faire economics, advocating minimal state intervention. The sources note this theory helped provide the intellectual framework for the transition from feudalism, based on inherited status and tradition, to capitalism, based on voluntary contract and individual enterprise. Now, later liberals moved beyond strict mechanistic concepts, but the core individualist and contractual foundation remained influential.
Okay, let's dive into the social contract theory first, as it's a major pillar of this perspective.
It is. The core idea here is that the state and political authority don't come from nature or divine right, but originate from a mutual agreement or contract among individuals.
Right.
People deliberately come together and agree to form a society and a state for certain definite purposes, primarily to serve their needs and interests better than they could alone.
And the big names associated with this are Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The sources highlight their different purposes in using this theory.
Yeah, their context really shaped their versions of the contract. Thomas Hobbes, writing during the turmoil of the English Civil War, used the idea in Leviathan back in 1651 to justify the need for an absolute, all-powerful sovereign as the only way to escape chaos and ensure social solidarity.
He saw the breakdown of order and felt only absolute power could restore it. That makes sense given the context.
Exactly. John Locke, in contrast, used the theory in his two treatises of civil government in 1690 to justify the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the establishment of constitutional monarchy.
Okay.
He argued the contract created a government with limited powers and that people had the right to remove a ruler who broke the terms of the contract and became tyrannical.
So the same idea, a contract used by Hobbes to centralize power and by Locke to limit it.
Uh-huh.
That's interesting.
Precisely. It shows the versatility of the concept, doesn't it? Rousseau, writing later in Discourse on Inequality and the Social Contract, didn't have a specific political event to justify, but his ideas about popular sovereignty and the general will profoundly influenced revolutionary movements, particularly the French Revolution.
And central to all their theories is the concept of the state of nature. How did Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau imagine this hypothetical existence before organized society and government? They differed quite a bit, didn't they?
Strikingly different views, yeah. Reflecting their different assumptions about human nature, Hobbes painted a very bleak picture.
Right, the famous nasty, brutish, and short life.
Exactly. Based on his belief that humans are fundamentally selfish, driven by self-interest and passions, he described the state of nature as a perpetual struggle, ceaseless conflict, and constant warfare. Life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Because with everyone having roughly equal physical and mental capabilities, nobody could truly dominate, leading to total insecurity.
Yes. Total insecurity. No industry, no culture, only a life where might is right. He saw this not necessarily as historical fact, but as the logical outcome of a situation without settled government. Natural rights were merely natural powers used to oppress others, and liberty was just the freedom to do anything necessary to preserve one's own life.
And it was the unbearable condition of this state of nature, driven by the fear of death and the instinct for self-preservation, that pushed people to accept the laws of nature, these rules of prudence like seeking peace and keeping contracts, and ultimately form a state.
Yes, the extreme discomfort and danger of the state of nature were the motivators for escaping it through a contract. Now, Locke's view of the state of nature was far more optimistic.
The sources describe it as a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation. Much nicer.
Entirely different, yeah. He saw it as a state of liberty, but not license, governed by natural law, an innate moral sense accessible through reason. Most people, being rational, would respect this natural law and treat others with dignity. However, he acknowledged it wasn't perfect.
The sources call it an inconvenient state of nature. Why inconvenient?
Yes. The inconvenience arose because, without established authority, it was difficult to enforce the natural law effectively. People were judges in their own cases, which, leads to bias and injustice in dealing with offenders.
Right.
To rectify this inconvenience, not to escape utter brutality like in Hobbes, people agreed to form civil society and government via contract.
And for Locke, natural law was about innate morality, while natural rights included perfect freedom and equality, the right to preserved property, defined broadly as life, liberty, and estate, and the right to judge and punish those who violated natural law.
Correct. And when entering civil society, they surrendered only the right to judge and punish breaches of the law, vesting it in the community or a designated umpire. Crucially, they retained their fundamental natural rights to life, liberty, and property.
Okay.
Locke's account is seen more as a hypothetical explanation of legitimate government rather than a historical claim about origins.
Rousseau's state of nature sounds different again, involving the noble savage.
Yes, in his discourse on inequality, he painted this fascinating picture of natural man living in idyllic, primitive simplicity, self-sufficient, and contented. He argued that inequalities arose with civilization, agriculture, private property, and the division of labor, which then necessitated civil society.
The sources note he somewhat paradoxically sees the state as an evil, but then immediately justifies its legitimacy. How does that work?
He acknowledges that the civil state deprives man of his natural liberty, yeah. But he argues the basis for any legitimate authority is agreement among men. He states, "No man has a natural authority over other men, and since might never makes right, it follows that agreements are the basis for all legitimate authority among men."
Okay.
He contended that the loss of natural liberty was more than compensated for when entering civil society.
So despite their different views of pre-state existence, they all saw the state as originating from a conscious human agreement, a contract.
Yeah.
How did the contract itself differ for each of them?
Well, for Hobbes, it was a single contract made among the people themselves, agreeing to give up their natural liberty to a sovereign.
The sovereign wasn't part of the deal.
No, the sovereign was not a party to this contract, but rather the result of it. This meant the people unconditionally surrendered their liberty to the sovereign, creating absolute sovereignty from the outset. The sources point out that Hobbes doesn't fully explain how imperfect people can create something with such absolute, unchallengeable authority. It's a bit of a leap.
So the deal is between the people to create a ruler they then have no power over. That sounds risky.
That's the logical outcome in Hobbes's system. The price of escaping utter anarchy is total submission to an absolute power. Locke's contract was more complex, sometimes described as having multiple stages.
The sources reference Jeremy Waldron's description of 3 stages for Locke.
Yes. First, individuals unanimously agree to form a political community and pool their powers to uphold rights. Second, the community decides, ideally by majority vote, to set up legislative and other governing institutions. And third, property owners consent to taxation, either directly or through representatives.
That's a much different setup than Hobbes. Society is formed, then government is set up by society.
Exactly. This structure places the government under the control of society, and ultimately the people, leaving no philosophical room for absolutism.
Right.
Locke believed that fundamental natural rights, life, liberty, property, were held as a trust from God and could not be transferred to arbitrary power. Government was established specifically to protect these rights, not to violate or undermine them. For example, taking property without consent was illegitimate.
So Locke's contract leads to a constitutional government based on limited powers and retained rights.
Precisely. It was a conditional and partial surrender of rights. People gave up only the right to be their own judge and executioner, entrusting that power to the community or an authority. But they kept their fundamental rights to life, liberty, and property.
Okay.
Society retained the authority to monitor the government and ensure it adhered to the terms of the contract, that is, protecting natural rights.
And this implied the government must govern according to reason and natural law, and crucially, that people had the right to revolution if the government failed in its duty, which, conveniently for him, justified the Glorious Revolution.
Yes, it provided a strong philosophical basis for limited government and the right to resist tyranny. His emphasis on property rights, seen as derived from mixing labor with natural resources, also strongly influenced his view that taxation required the property owner's consent.
Rousseau's contract is often seen as creating absolute sovereignty, like Hobbes, but located differently.
Yes, exactly. Like Hobbes, he envisioned a single contract that created absolute, indivisible, and inalienable sovereignty. But, and this is the key difference, this sovereignty wasn't vested in a ruler separate from society. It resided in the people themselves.
Popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty, right. Individuals didn't surrender their rights to a ruler, but to the collective whole. What they gave up individually, they gained back corporately in an improved form through the collective will. As Rousseau put it, each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole.
The general will that's often seen as his unique contribution and a foundational concept for modern democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely. Robert Mixler called it the secret of Rousseau's doctrine, substituting a sovereign of the sovereign, the general will, which Rousseau described as one indivisible and even inerrant, incapable of being wrong.
So, the somewhat precarious liberty of the state of nature is exchanged for a more assured and enlarged liberty within the social order, with law expressing the general will being the form of its realization. And the problem of political obligation is solved because government is rooted in this general will.
That's the idea. It leads to his crucial distinction between the particular will, your immediate selfish interest, driven by passions, which is transient and unstable, and the general will,
Okay.
which is your ultimate collective interest, guided by reason, representing your better self, which is stable and consistent.
And freedom, for Rousseau, means overcoming your particular will to follow the general will, subordinating self-interest.
Yes, subordinating your self-interest to the common interest or the common good, as expressed by the general will. The general will harmonizes the true interests of each individual with the interests of all. It's not a mere compromise, but what is highest and most rational in every person, the spirit of citizenship. The particular will can be misguided, but the general will always points towards the right way.
The sources note this emphasis on the general will can lead Rousseau towards an idealist position, where the general will seems synonymous with absolute wisdom and the state based on it with absolute perfection, which sounds a bit dangerous.
Which, again, can be philosophically problematic and potentially dangerous in practice, yeah. As it can justify the state claiming an infallible understanding of the common good, potentially overriding individual dissent in the name of that will.
Okay, that covers the core mechanics of the social contract theory and its variations.
Mm-hmm.
But just like the organic theory, it faces significant criticisms according to the sources.
Yes, the critiques are quite pointed. First, and probably the most common one, is the sheer lack of historical evidence.
Right, it's a thought experiment more than history.
Largely seen as a philosophical fiction, yeah, not founded on historical fact. There's no scientific evidence that states actually originated from a conscious mutual agreement of individuals emerging from a pre-social state of nature.
The Mayflower Compact is sometimes cited as an example, but the sources dismiss that. Why?
Right. It's noted that the men who signed the Mayflower Compact were already familiar with government and social organization. They weren't emerging from a true state of nature to create a political entity from scratch.
Okay.
Also, Sir Henry Maine's historical research on early legal institutions found no evidence that society originated in a deliberate contract. He argued historical development moved from status, inherited position, to contract, voluntary agreement, over time, not the other way around.
A third criticism questions the fundamental validity of the contract itself. How so?
Well, a standard legal contract requires the sanction of an existing legal framework, typically provided by a state, to be valid and enforceable. But the social contract supposedly precedes the state. It's what creates the state.
So it lacks the very authority it's meant to create. A bit circular.
Exactly. It lacks this necessary sanction, creating a kind of logical problem regarding its validity.
And what about the theory's assertion of natural liberty and natural rights existing before the state?
That's a fourth major criticism. Critics argue that the very concept of rights is a product of a developed social consciousness and is enforced by institutionalized law. How could rights, as we understand them, exist in a pre-political state without any social or legal recognition or enforcement?
Good point.
Edmund Burke, a critic, argued that if a contract did exist, it marked the surrender of these supposed natural rights, not their preservation.
A fifth point is whether such a historical contract, even if it happened, could be eternally binding on future generations. That seems unfair.
Philosophically, many find it unfair and illogical, yeah. To argue that people living today should be bound by an agreement made by people centuries ago, Thomas Paine famously criticized this idea as a dead weight, arguing that each generation must be free to act for itself.
And finally, the theory is criticized for failing to adequately address existing social inequality.
Right. While the theory claims the state harmonizes interests or embodies a general will, in reality, dominant sections of society can often claim to represent the will or the common interest, using the theory to justify their own authority and the existing power structure. The theory doesn't provide a robust mechanism for addressing or rectifying inherent inequalities and injustices.
So while the social contract theory played a significant historical role in challenging ideas of divine right and tradition, providing a framework for consent-based government and the transition to relations based on contract, it has some serious holes.
Yes, it was hugely influential in shaping modern political thought and institutions, absolutely. But its historical basis and some of its core philosophical assumptions about pre-social rights and the binding nature of an original contract are heavily questioned by critics.
Okay. Moving on from the social contract is the origin story. Another key component of the liberal individualist perspective, particularly in its earlier forms, is laissez-faire individualism.
Right. This theory embodies the core liberal concern with individual liberty by advocating for a very limited role for the state. It views the state as a necessary evil.
Necessary evil. How so?
Evil because any state power involves some restriction on individual freedom, but necessary because some minimal framework of law and order is needed to safeguard that very freedom from violation by others.
So it advocates for minimal intervention by the state, especially in the economy, the classic idea of leave alone.
Precisely, that's what laissez-faire means. It sets very strict limits on the government's regulatory powers over social and economic processes. It developed primarily with classical liberalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, placing the rational, self-interested individual at the center, believing each person is the best judge of their own interests.
What were the key freedoms championed by this view? Freedom of contract.
Freedoms of trade, contract, bargaining, and enterprise were central.
Yeah.
Private property was seen as absolutely essential, a condition for progress, a product of individual labor, ingenuity, enterprise, and ultimately beneficial for society. The profit motive and competition were seen as functional mechanisms that naturally led to social progress and efficiency.
And the government's role was strictly circumscribed, kept to a minimum.
Very much so. Its primary functions were limited to protecting individual freedom and liberty, enforcing voluntary contracts, guaranteeing the peaceful enjoyment of private property, and providing the external conditions of law and order necessary for individuals to pursue their interests freely.
Who were the major thinkers associated with this? Adam Smith, obviously.
Yeah. Adam Smith is a towering figure, yeah, particularly for the economic side. Jeremy Bentham and James Mill contributed through utilitarianism, and Herbert Spencer represents a sort of extreme form. John Stuart Mill is often discussed here, but he's really seen as bridging the gap towards later forms of liberalism.
Let's start with Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics. What was his core argument?
His seminal work, The Wealth of Nations from 1776, provided a powerful argument for free markets. He was influenced by the French physiocrats, who believed in the goodness of nature and man and argued governments should conform to natural laws, leaving individuals free unless they harmed others. Smith advocated free trade and minimal government intervention in the economy.
The sources mention the term economic man in relation to this period. Was that Smith's term?
No, that term was actually used by later critics, particularly in the 19th century, to kind of caricature and criticize the focus on selfish, self-interested behavior in the economic theories of classical liberalism. While classical economists did stress self-interest as a primary motivator in the market, the source notes it wasn't necessarily to the complete exclusion of higher values in their broader philosophy, though critics argued it was the practical effect.
Smith's concept of natural liberty seems key to his economic view. What did he mean by that?
Yes, he believed that as long as a person didn't violate the laws of justice, they should be completely free to pursue their own interest in their own way, bringing their industry and capital into competition with others.
Right.
He argued the sovereign should be discharged from the duty of superintending individuals' industry or directing how they use their capital, as individuals guided by self-interest would, as if by an invisible hand, promote the overall wealth of the nation more effectively than government planning could.
And he defined the government's essential duties very narrowly in 3 specific points. Let's detail those.
Okay. First, the duty of protecting society from violence and invasion by other societies, basically, national defense.
Got it.
Second, the duty of protecting, as far as possible, every member of society from the injustice or oppression of every other member, establishing a system for the administration of justice, like courts and police. And third, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and public institutions, which, while highly beneficial for society, aren't profitable enough for any individual or small group to undertake things like roads, bridges, harbors, maybe some basic education infrastructure.
So state limited to defense, justice, and certain non-profitable public goods. That's a very minimal state, the night watchman idea almost.
Exactly. His policy recommendations followed directly. Abolish restrictions like mercantilist tariffs, allow free market competition, freedom of enterprise, free trade, and freedom of contract.
Now, Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism, how did that support laissez-faire? It seems focused on happiness for everyone.
Well, Bentham's philosophy was based on the principle of utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He believed human behavior is fundamentally driven by the desire for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Utility, for him, was the tendency of something to produce pleasure or prevent pain. The right action was the one that resulted in the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for all affected. He famously believed pleasures and pains could be measured quantitatively, arguing, maybe provocatively, that quantity of pleasure being equal, pushpin is as good as poetry.
Pushpin, like the game.
Yeah, meaning all pleasures were equal in kind, only differing in quantity. And his method for measuring this was the hedonistic or philosophic calculus.
What now?
The philosophic calculus. He outlined specific criteria: intensity, duration, certainty, proximity, fecundity, likelihood of producing more pleasure, purity, likelihood of not producing pain, and crucially, extent, the number of people affected. The first six measure individual utility, but extent introduces the public dimension, the happiness of the society.
So the goal of government for Bentham was to promote the happiness of society using the tools of law, punishments, and rewards.
Yes, the justification for the state's existence and authority was its ability to promote the aggregate happiness of its subjects. An ineffectual government, in this view, lost its title to rule.
Okay.
Bentham saw legislation as the main function of the state, aimed primarily at removing institutional restrictions that hindered individuals from freely pursuing their own happiness. Since individuals were seen as the best judges of their own interests, and the state couldn't really improve character from the outside, the state's role was limited. It should only intervene to restrain activities that clearly reduce the general happiness and to punish offenders.
Essentially, let law-abiding citizens pursue their own path to happiness without interference, because they know best what makes them happy.
That's the core laissez-faire implication from utilitarianism, yeah. James Mill, Bentham's close follower, also advocated for a limited state, focused on protection and administering the law of equal freedom.
And Herbert Spencer took these ideas to a rather extreme degree, didn't he?
He is often cited as an exponent of extreme laissez-faire, yeah, heavily influenced by applying evolutionary theory, like Darwin's ideas, to society.
Social Darwinism.
Exactly. He famously saw the state as little more than a joint stock protection company for mutual assurance, whose functions should be severely restricted. He argued against the state providing public health services or poor relief, believing such interventions interfered with the natural process of social evolution, the struggle for existence, and the survival of the fittest.
Applying that concept directly to human society, that sounds pretty harsh.
Yes, he believed that applying family ethics, caring for the weak and vulnerable to the state level would actually retard social progress by perpetuating undeserving life. He saw the elimination of the weak as a harsh but necessary part of societal advancement. He really pushed the concept of negative liberty, freedom from interference to an extreme.
That's a stark, almost brutal perspective on the role of the state.
It certainly highlights the potential consequences of carrying the principle of non-interference to its philosophical limit. Now, interestingly, some of these laissez-faire ideas saw a significant revival in the late 20th century.
That's the rise of libertarianism, right? Sort of modern version.
Yes, the term libertarianism gained prominence to describe this renewed emphasis on maximal individual liberty and minimal state intervention. It arose partly from dissatisfaction with the growth of the welfare state and a desire to return to core classical liberal concerns with freedom.
What are the key tenets of modern libertarianism? What do they stand for?
Well, it champions full individual autonomy and freedom from restricting institutions of all kinds, including social ones like religion or family, and political ones like the state. Philosophically, it often emphasizes that individuals are the masters of their own destiny, rejecting determinism. It is strongly hostile to social and legal restrictions on individual action and choice.
And they particularly focus on economic activity, freeing it up.
Absolutely. Libertarians insist on the liberation of economic activity from restrictions, viewing it as essential for progress and prosperity. They draw heavily on Locke's idea of natural rights, arguing that certain rights precede political life, are indefeasible, and cannot legitimately be surrendered or violated by the state.
Like the right to acquire and hold property and freedom of contract, those key Lockean ideas.
Precisely. They see these rights as existing prior to and independently of the state, meaning the state has no business intervening to balance or redistribute them artificially. This leads to a strong condemnation of taxation for welfare purposes.
Why is that?
They view it as a forced transfer of the fruits of one person's labor to another, seeing it as inherently unjust and a disincentive to productivity. They argue that laissez-faire capitalism, allowing free enterprise and exchange, is the system most conducive to social progress.
There are different shades, though, right? From extreme to moderate.
Oh, yeah. The extreme form borders on philosophical anarchism, arguing all government is illegitimate and that protection functions should be handled by private agencies. The more moderate view concedes the need for a limited, legitimate government whose role is restricted to police protection, enforcing contracts through courts, and national defense, the night watchman state idea again.
Okay.
Taxation, in this moderate view, should be strictly limited to funding only these specific functions.
And key figures in this revival: Hayek, Friedman.
F.A. Hayek, Isaiah Berlin, known for his distinction between negative and positive liberty, strongly favoring negative. Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick are prominent examples, yes.
Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia from '74, is often seen as a key modern philosophical defense of this minimal state.
Yes, he followed Locke's method, starting from individuals with rights in a state of nature. He argued that private protective agencies would emerge, and one dominant agency achieving a de facto monopoly on force in a territory would effectively become a state-like entity. But, he argued, this minimal state has no legitimate powers beyond protection, justice, and defense. It is not authorized for redistributive taxation or welfare programs.
So the welfare state is philosophically ruled out.
Completely.
Fundamentally, yes. He argued that property acquired or transferred without force or fraud is just, based on entitlement, either through justly acquiring previously unowned property or receiving it from someone with a just title. Legal rights are products of voluntary exchanges, and inequalities resulting from just processes shouldn't be rectified through forced distribution.
Okay.
He did include a complex caveat about cases like a monopoly on a vital resource like water in a desert where things might be different. He argued that a libertarian society, by allowing individuals maximum freedom to shape their own lives, represents the most plausible form of utopia.
That gives a very clear picture of the highly limited state advocated by this perspective. It does. It represents a philosophical commitment to maximizing individual liberty by minimizing state power, particularly in the economic realm. However, this story of liberalism doesn't end with laissez-faire. The practical consequences of unregulated 19th century capitalism became increasingly difficult to ignore.
Right, leading to the transition to positive liberalism.
Right.
Things had to change.
Exactly. The success of industrial capitalism led to enormous wealth accumulation, but it also created vast inequalities and harsh conditions for vulnerable populations, the industrial working class, peasants, consumers. Freedom of contract in practice often meant factory owners were free to dictate terms that led to brutal exploitation of labor,
Resulting in
insecurity, child labor, overcrowded slums, dangerous working conditions, production of unsafe goods. The lack of state regulation had disastrous social consequences, really flying in the face of the utilitarian goal of maximizing general happiness.
So the theoretical justification for laissez-faire, based on individual equality and rational pursuit of happiness, began to break down in the face of reality.
Yes. Even Bentham's utilitarianism faced a dilemma. While it advocated for treating each individual as one and calculating aggregate happiness, applying this to market outcomes resulted in persistent inequality. He saw a case for equality based on the principle of diminishing marginal utility. The more wealth you have, the less additional happiness another unit brings.
Which would suggest more equal distribution is better for overall happiness.
Exactly. It would suggest greater aggregate happiness with a more equal distribution, but he ended up justifying inequality.
Why? How did he escape that logic?
He prioritized productivity over equality, arguing that securing unequal capital accumulation was necessary for driving productivity, and maintaining a large labor force incentivized by the fear of starvation was necessary for the market to maximize output. It was a harsh rationale that became increasingly challenged.
The growing power of the working class and increasing socialist movements also put pressure on liberal thinkers, didn't they?
Absolutely. The deteriorating conditions and the rise of movements explicitly challenging capitalism forced liberals to confront the contradiction. Their cherished freedom was, in the context of unchecked capitalism, creating a new form of oppression and suffering for many. They needed to revise their theory to address these social realities and, frankly, maintain the relevance of liberalism.
This is where the idea of the welfare state begins to take shape.
Positive liberalism emerged, promoting the idea that the state needed to play a more active, positive role, not just removing obstacles to freedom, which is negative liberty, but actively creating the conditions for individuals to flourish and ensuring social justice, which is positive liberty.
Okay.
This involved regulating the economic system to protect the vulnerable and provide support for the poor and deprived, integrating concerns for equality and justice within the liberal framework.
Who are the key figures driving this shift towards positive liberalism? J.S. Mill.
John Stuart Mill is often seen as the great transitional figure from classical to positive liberalism, yes. Thomas Hill Green, L.T. Hobhouse, Harold J. Lasky, and Robert M. McCulver are major exponents of this developed positive liberal theory.
Let's start with John Stuart Mill. He's such a pivotal figure. He started out quite differently, didn't he?
Yes, a brilliant mind who grew up firmly in the Benthamite tradition and initially defended laissez-faire. But he was deeply affected by the social problems of his time and revised his views significantly, becoming a champion of positive liberalism. He's often described as supporting a constitutional and representative government in the political sphere while showing increasingly socialist leanings in the economic sphere, laying the groundwork for the welfare state idea.
And he revised utilitarianism itself, moving beyond Bentham.
Critically, yes. While accepting happiness as the goal, he broke from Bentham's purely quantitative measure of pleasure. Mill argued that some pleasures were qualitatively superior to others.
Like intellectual or moral pleasures.
Exactly. Intellectual, moral, and aesthetic pleasures were inherently higher than purely physical ones, regardless of quantity. He famously said, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied."
That's a great quote. And this qualitatively different view seems to shift the focus from just maximizing pleasure to something else entirely.
It does. It moves a criterion from simply aggregating indifferent utilities to emphasizing the maximum development and use of human capacities are moral, intellectual, aesthetic, and productive potential. As the source notes, McPherson argues this revised criterion subtly changes the focus of utilitarianism.
Mill was also an ardent defender of liberty, particularly freedom of thought and expression. His work on liberty is famous for that. He defended it on two main grounds.
First, on grounds of utility to society. He argued that the pursuit of truth and rational knowledge is fundamental to human welfare, and this requires free discussion and debate to test and extend knowledge. As Joad described it, his defense is the most famous vindication of freedom of thought, a powerful plea for the toleration of opinions.
Right.
He even argued for protecting the freedom of expression for cranks, believing that even if 9 ideas out of 10 were wrong, the one might be more valuable than all conventional wisdom.
And the second ground was human dignity.
Yes, independent of its utility to society, individual self-determination is a basic human right, indispensable for moral responsibility. No thought or action has moral significance unless it's followed freely, consciously, and as a result of personal conviction. Kramnik and Watkins are quoted making this point.
Mill also attempted a practical distinction regarding where the state could interfere. Self-regarding versus other regarding actions. How did that work?
He argued individuals should have complete freedom over actions that affect only themselves, self-regarding. But the community does have a right to intervene and coerce if an action is prejudicial to the welfare of others, other regarding.
No.
He even conceded the state could intervene in self-regarding actions if they were clearly and severely injurious to the individual, like physically preventing someone from crossing a clearly unsafe bridge.
This distinction faced criticism itself, right? It sounds hard to draw that line.
Yes. Thinkers like Ernest Barker criticized it, arguing that in a complex society, hardly any action is purely self-regarding. Almost everything has potential consequences for others. Barker suggested a different division, a sphere of voluntary action for free cooperation within society and a sphere of uniform and regulated action where compulsory enforcement by the state is necessary. This reflected a shift towards a more pluralistic view.
However, the source emphasizes the historical importance of Mill's distinction even if flawed.
It was a crucial step away from the earlier laissez-faire view that placed almost all individual behavior beyond state regulation. Even if imperfect, it was an attempt to define a legitimate sphere for state intervention in the interests of community welfare, signaling a move towards a more humane society that addressed the harsh realities of 19th century capitalism.
And his views on property and socialism also evolved towards positive liberalism. He wasn't always a fan of property rights.
He initially criticized socialism in Principles of Political Economy, but in later editions, he significantly revised his views on property rights. He concluded that property rights were not absolute or sacrosanct. He advocated for restrictions on inheritance and bequest and argued that property and land was fundamentally different and not sacrosanct because no man made the land. It was the original inheritance of mankind.
Right.
He saw landlords who gained wealth simply from the appreciation of land value without their own labor as receiving unearned increment.
And this unearned increment should be subject to heavy taxation, he thought.
Yes, he argued this unearned income should be taxed heavily, and the additional wealth generated diverted to the welfare of the working class, who were the true producers. This position on taxation and limiting property rights significantly influenced the development of positive liberalism.
Hobhouse followed up on this.
L.T. Hobhouse, for instance, in his work Liberalism, further developed the idea of the social basis of property, arguing that fortunes are built on collective effort and that society, as an indispensable partner, has a right to tax property because the holder owes it to society.
Okay, moving to Thomas Hill Green, another major figure in positive liberalism, influenced by idealism like Hegel.
Green drew on the philosophies of Rousseau and Hegel, blending them with liberal concerns. His central contribution is his concept of moral freedom, which is quite different from earlier liberal ideas of freedom.
Distinguishing between negative and positive liberty again.
Exactly. He saw negative liberty as merely the absence of external restraint, being left alone, acting on arbitrary desires. Positive liberty, for Green, was something higher, the power to act by reason, to realize your true potential, to achieve self-perfection.
Okay.
True liberty was acting from a good will, identifying with your ideal rational self, not just your immediate desires. As Ernest Barker summarized Green's view, liberty is therefore no negative absence of restraint. It is a positive power of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying.
And his theory of rights is tied to this concept of positive liberty. Where do rights come from for Green?
Yes, the exercise of true positive liberty requires the existence of rights. But unlike Locke, Green argued rights don't come from a transcendental natural law. They arise from social recognition within a community.
Social recognition.
Yeah, individuals as moral beings recognize the capacity for pursuing ideal objects in others. Since these ideal objects are ultimately common, Green believed there shouldn't be a fundamental clash between rights.
So social consciousness is the real source of rights, not the state legislature.
Precisely. Rights emanate from the moral consciousness of the community, not from the legislature or the state. They are conditions necessary for individuals to achieve their moral end. The state recognizes and maintains these rights, but it is not their ultimate source. Society or the community is seen as primary, the eternal source of this moral consciousness, while the state is secondary, an instrument.
And the state's role. Is it an instrument of perfection or an embodiment of perfection like Hegel saw it?
Green sees it as an instrument of perfection. That's the liberal element, not the embodiment of perfection, which distinguishes him from Hegel. The state arises from the social nature of men. He believed human personality is inherently social and requires social organization and recognized rights to achieve moral freedom. The state's function is to maintain the framework of rights, which provides the essential base for moral freedom.
Does this emphasis on the community mean the individual is subordinated, like in some interpretations of Rousseau or Hegel?
Well, Green does favor subordinating the individual's particular will to the common good and insists on the citizen's duty to follow the general will. But he remains within the liberal tradition by insisting on the importance of individual rights.
Okay.
The state, while recognizing and maintaining rights, must ultimately obey the moral consciousness of the community. Positive law, made by the state, can be criticized and improved based on the state's ideal purpose, fostering the moral perfection of its citizens.
The source quotes Barker again, describing Green's view of the state's function as essentially a negative function, removing obstructions.
Yeah.
How is that positive liberalism?
Right. Green argues the state cannot directly make its members moral or better, That must come from individual effort and a good will. Its function is the negative one of removing obstacles or hindrances that prevent individuals from making themselves better or pursuing things worth doing or enjoying. However, compared to laissez-faire's minimal state, removing obstacles like poverty, ignorance, or disease requires significant state intervention. So, even though he calls it negative, removing these hindrances is actually a very positive function compared to just letting things be.
Ah, I see. Removing obstacles requires positive action.
Exactly. His conception of the state as an agent for moral improvement naturally led him to advocate for state intervention in areas like compulsory education to remove ignorance.
What about his view on property? Did he see issues there?
He generally upheld the right to property as necessary for an individual to realize their will and direct it towards social good. He defended property and capital, seeing it as not inherently antisocial and distributed through wages and profits. He saw differences in property as functional and recognized by social conscience.
But he encountered a significant dilemma when confronting the realities of capitalist inequality, like Mill.
Yes. He recognized that when the existing system of property rights created conditions where some people accumulated excessive wealth, while others were prevented from acquiring enough property or resources necessary for their own self-realization, a necessary condition for moral freedom, it created a major obstacle to that very moral freedom he championed.
Right.
He clearly saw the malady of the capitalist system creating these conditions. However, he mistakenly located the origin of this problem primarily in the specific system of landed property in England, which had roots in the feudal past, rather than seeing it as an inherent issue within capitalist enterprise itself.
McPherson is quoted critiquing Green for this, arguing he lacked insight into the nature of capitalism and blamed the problems on feudal remnants and landowners rather than the capitalist structure.
It was a significant blind spot, yeah. But despite this, Green's contribution was profound. He found moral foundations for social life and argued for the subordination of the state to a society embodying moral consciousness, moving liberalism towards recognizing a more active state role and promoting the conditions for a good life.
Moving into the 20th century, Harold J. Lasky is another major figure who developed liberal theory in response to changing times, wars, revolution, depression.
Lasky's thinking was heavily shaped by the tumultuous events of the early to mid-20th century, absolutely. World War I, the Russian Revolution, the rise of fascism, the Great Depression, World War II. He was deeply concerned with the crisis of capitalism, but was skeptical of the outcomes of socialist revolutions, seeking instead to achieve socialist goals through reforming liberal democracy.
He was a strong critic of both capitalism and the power state, the sources say.
Very much so. He spoke frankly about capitalism's breakdown, evidenced by mass unemployment, devastated areas, failing industries. He was particularly critical of the undemocratic power wielded by economic overlords in modern capitalist societies, their irresponsible power holding states to ransom, prioritizing their narrow interests over the communities.
So he saw a clear tension between this concentrated economic power and the broader societal interest.
Yes. But he also observed a significant change in the liberal state itself, its increasing undertaking of social welfare measures, particularly since World War I.
Like health, education, social insurance.
Exactly. He listed services like health, education, housing, social insurance, and labor regulations as provided at taxpayer expense, attributing this shift to a profounder social conscience developing within the state.
And this led him to reject the classical Marxist view of the state as purely an instrument of class. He didn't buy that.
Precisely. He argued that the modern liberal state's welfare activities demonstrated it wasn't merely a tool of the property-owning class. He stated, no modern state would subordinate human rights to the interests of property. This is shown by the whole character of modern legislation. It is rhetorical exaggeration to regard it as a class instrument.
He saw the state's welfare actions as evidence it was serving broader human rights, not just property interests.
Yes, and this provided a key justification for the liberal state's continued existence and potential for good. While he wasn't drawn to the vision of a stateless society and maintained a clear distinction between state and society, warning against granting absolute authority to fallible state officials, he still paid significant tribute to the state as the keystone of the social arch.
But he didn't see the state as inherently perfect or divine, like Hegel's idealist view. Not quite.
No, his faith was in the state's perfectibility. He believed that if the state fulfilled certain functions essentially, addressing human needs and ensuring welfare, it could become an instrument serving human perfection.
Okay.
His criterion for evaluating any state was its will and ability to secure to its citizens the maximum satisfaction of their wants, emphasizing the essential requirement of absence of bias towards any special group. If a state became perverted to serve only special interests, revolution would likely ensue.
So, Lasky's view is that the state isn't inherently a tool of class oppression. If it acts that way, it's a perversion, and any state has the potential to serve humanity's interests if it's unbiased and focused on welfare.
That's his core argument. He envisioned a transformation of liberal democracy outlined in works like A Grammar of Politics, involving both political reforms and an economic toning down of capitalism's harshness through welfare policies. He didn't advocate for the total abolition of private enterprise, but aimed to eliminate enormous economic disparities through progressive taxation.
Using taxation of the wealthy to fund social programs.
Yes, seeing it as necessary for establishing a system of rights and providing public goods, he viewed the wealth of the rich as creating unavoidable privileges that necessitated taxation for the benefit of society.
So Lasky's transformation involved democratizing economic power through increased public control, reducing disparities via progressive taxation, and an increasingly welfare-oriented democratic state, trying to find a middle way, almost.
It was an attempt to steer liberalism towards explicitly social democratic goals within a democratic framework, hoping to avert more radical change.
Yeah. Finally, in this section, Robert M. McCulver, a 20th century sociologist who also contributed to positive liberalism. What was his take?
McCulver traced the historical evolution of the state and, like Green and Lasky, maintained a strong distinction between state and society. He rejected the social contract theory as unhistorical, and, while agreeing with Green's distinction between the spheres of law, enforced by the state, and morality, he grounded rights in social recognition rather than moral consciousness alone.
So for McCulver, the state has a limited sphere and isn't the totality of society's activity. Society is bigger than the state.
Exactly. Society for McCulver is a vast network of associations created by individuals to meet diverse needs, material, intellectual, moral, spiritual. The state is just one such association, albeit a uniquely powerful one. Society existed long before the state, and many essential activities function outside the state's direct regulation. He argued the state isn't morally superior to other associations, but possesses unique authority as the instrument of law.
And he saw law as existing, in a sense, above the state, or prior to it.
Yes, or prior to it. The state declares and enforces law, but it doesn't create it arbitrarily. As he stated, the government has power as the guardian of the Constitution, as the executor of law, not in its own right. The state shapes law, but law has a prior existence rooted in social custom and necessity.
And based on this, the state should refrain from interfering in activities judged by spirit, not external conduct, like art or religion.
Precisely. He argued that the whole creative side of human life, creative thought, artistic endeavor, religion, morality, are outside the legitimate sphere of the state because they are judged by internal motivation and spirit, not external compliance. The state's function is limited to enforcing the external acts necessary for maintaining order and facilitating the good life within society.
And it doesn't regulate the internal affairs of other associations, like clubs or churches.
No. The state doesn't dictate the purpose or methods of voluntary associations. Its role comes into play when the interests of different groups or associations conflict. The state acts as an impartial arbiter, resolving conflicting claims. It is not entitled to impose its own will for a theoretical common interest, but rather harmonizes the interests that are originally expressed and developed through society's various associations.
This sounds like his well-known service state theory. The state serves society.
Yes. Society, with its vast array of associations, provides for the diverse needs of its members. The state is one specific association performing specific, albeit crucial, functions. Its authority is limited by the services it renders and the obligations it fulfills to society. McCulver stated, "The state commands only because it serves. It owns only because it owes. The servant is not greater than his master. The state's rights are limited by its function of guaranteeing the rights and interests that originate in society."
But he also saw the state as playing a crucial role in social unity and solidarity, didn't he? It wasn't just another association.
Absolutely. While not omnicompetent, the state is an effective organ for social unity and solidarity, symbolizing civilization's achievement. Its peculiar, unique function is that of giving a form of unity to the whole system of social relationships. It shapes this unity not by absorbing all of society's activities, but by providing the framework of law and order that allows diverse social life to flourish together.
And he argued that only a democratic state could effectively perform this unifying function. Why democracy?
Yes, he saw the modern democratic state as distinct from earlier forms. It can only truly act as a unifying agent if it has evolved towards democracy. For McClover, democracy is the proper form of the state because it's only under democratic conditions that the state can achieve its unique function of being an instrument of reconciliation, conflict resolution, and representing the interests of all society, not just a particular class, a departure from most historical state forms.
The source commentary includes a critique of McGelver, questioning whether he sufficiently apprehended the potential for capitalist evils as long as the democratic mechanism was in place. Is that fair?
That critique is raised, yeah, suggesting that perhaps even with democracy, the inherent power imbalances within capitalism might limit the state's ability to be a truly impartial or just unifier. Recent arguments by thinkers like James Burnham or C. Wright Mills suggesting power might shift from capitalists to managerial or elite groups are also mentioned as complicating the picture of power in modern states.
So the tragedy of liberal theory, as summarized by the sources, is its great success in developing constitutional government and procedures, but its frequent invocation to justify the capitalist system, despite its inherent contradictions of dominance and dependence, even with welfare policies in place.
It suggests that while liberalism has evolved significantly from laissez-faire, addressing social justice fully may require a more fundamental transformation of the economic system itself, beyond just regulation and welfare, to truly eliminate those contradictions and secure social justice.
That was an extensive deep dive into the liberal individualist perspective, tracking its origins of the social contract and laissez-faire, its evolution into positive liberalism and the welfare state idea, and touching on more recent libertarian and pluralist expressions. A lot to take in.
It shows a dynamic body of thought, doesn't it? Continuously reacting to changing social and economic conditions over centuries.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now to a perspective that offers a fundamental challenge to both the organic and liberal views we've discussed, the idea of the state as an instrument of the dominant class.
Right. This is the class perspective, most strongly associated with Marxism. It sees the state not as a natural growth or a mechanism built by universal agreement, but as an artificial device imposed from above by one group on others.
And crucially, it's seen not as serving the interests of all, but specifically the interests of a dominant class. That's the core difference.
Precisely. Society, in this view, is understood through a historical analysis of conflict between antagonistic forces, or classes.
And where does this conflict originate, according to Marx?
It stems from the way goods are produced and distributed, the mode of production. The fundamental conflict arises when one class owns and controls the means of social production, things like land, factories, machinery, capital, and uses this ownership to compel another class, which owns only its ability to labor, to work on terms dictated by the owners.
And the resolution of this conflict, according to Marxism, involves overthrowing capitalism and socializing the means of production, getting rid of that private ownership.
Yes, leading to a system of universal labor and the full development of productive forces to meet everyone's needs. According to this theory, the state comes into existence specifically because society becomes divided into these antagonistic classes.
Right.
The emergence of private property creates this division. Those who own the means of production gain not just economic power, but power to dominate in all spheres of life.
So the state is subservient to economic power. Political power follows economic power.
Fundamentally, the dominant class, having established its economic stronghold through owning the means of production, then creates or captures political power embodied in the state apparatus, specifically to maintain and protect its economic position and its ability to exploit the labor of others.
Okay.
The state is seen as an instrument of the dominant class's will, imposed from above. It did not exist from time immemorial. It's a historical product of class conflict. It is not a natural institution.
That's a stark contrast to the organic theory, which saw the state as natural and inevitable.
Absolutely. The class theory makes a clear distinction between state and society. A society is seen as a natural and necessary institution for human survival and the production of material goods. Man is seen as a social animal, needing association to produce more, but not inherently a political animal requiring a state, which goes against Aristotle.
And the mode of production determines everything else in society. The economy is the base.
Yes, it's seen as the base that determines the superstructure of social relations, including political structures, law, intellectual life, religious beliefs, the whole culture.
Right.
The sources use examples like the hand mill producing feudal lord society and the steam mill producing industrial capitalist society. The key argument is that regardless of its specific form, the state is ultimately an instrument of the dominant economic class of that era.
Which leads to the view of the state as an instrument of class exploitation and oppression.
That's the central point, yeah. The dominant class uses the state's machinery, its laws, courts, police, military to secure its own interests, which fundamentally involve the exploitation of the dependent class. The state is seen not as having moral foundations or as an instrument for harmonizing interests, like the liberal view might suggest.
But rather as a device for suppressing class conflict and maintaining the power imbalance, keeping the system going.
Precisely. While it might create an illusion of order or even consent through ideological power, promoting beliefs that legitimize the system, its ultimate function is to use coercive power to ensure the compliance of the exploited class.
The pioneers of this theory, Marx, Engels, Lenin, were very explicit about this, weren't they? No mincing words.
They were unequivocally clear that the state is an organ of class rule and exploitation. Marx and Engels famously stated in the Communist Manifesto, political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another.
And Engels echoed this, saying,
The state is an organization of the particular class which was pro tempore the exploiting class. And he tied this to history, describing the state of antiquity holding down slaves, the feudal state holding down serfs, and the modern representative state as an instrument for the exploitation of wage labor by capital.
Okay.
Lenin, in The State and Revolution, reiterated, according to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule. It is the creation of order which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between the classes.
So the state exists to manage and maintain the exploitative system inherent in class society, basically keeping a lid on things.
That's the core Marxist view. And because they see the state as fundamentally an embodiment of social injustice, their vision of emancipation involves moving towards a classless, stateless society.
How does that transition occur? Revolution.
Through a socialist revolution led by the proletariat, the propertyless working class. This revolution would involve the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the socialization of the means of production. In the immediate aftermath, there might be a phase where the state, now controlled by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, is still used as an instrument.
But this time against the old rulers.
Exactly. This time to suppress the former exploiting classes and prevent a return to capitalism.
And this is where the idea of the state withering away comes in. It just disappears.
Yes. Once the remnants of capitalism are eliminated, work becomes compulsory for all, and the forces of production are fully developed to satisfy everyone's needs, society becomes truly classless. Since the state is, by definition in this theory, an instrument of class rule, it becomes redundant in a classless society and withers away. It's no longer necessary.
Resulting in a future classless and stateless society based on cooperation, equality, and justice, rather than conflict, domination, and oppression. That's the end goal.
That's the ultimate historical trajectory envisioned by classical Marxism, yes.
Okay, that's a core class perspective. What are the main criticisms leveled against it in the sources? It's faced quite a few.
Oh, yeah. One key criticism challenges the idea of rigid class division. Critics argue that classes aren't fixed, impermeable blocks. There's often significant social mobility, with individuals able to change their status through effort, education, circumstances, blurring these sharp lines.
And the Marxist prediction that the middle class would disappear under capitalism, that didn't really happen, did it?
That prediction, central to the idea of polarization between capitalists and workers, has largely not materialized in many developed capitalist countries. Liberal researchers point out that the size of the middle class has often increased under capitalism, rather than disappearing.
Alternative theories also offer different explanations for power dynamics, beyond just ownership.
Yes, thinkers like James Burnham in The Managerial Revolution argued that power in modern capitalism shifts from traditional property owners to a managerial class that controls the means of production through administration, a shift not fully anticipated by classical class theory.
And the argument that 20th century capitalism evolved, developing a human face, becoming less brutal.
Critics of the class perspective, particularly liberals, argue that modern capitalism, especially with the development of the welfare state, has been significantly modified. extensive labor laws, progressive taxation, social services provided by the state. They see these as mitigating the harshness and exploitation of 19th century capitalism, making the state an instrument of social justice and reducing the relevance of class conflict and revolutionary predictions.
Then there are criticisms based on the historical experience of countries that actually attempted to implement socialist revolutions. Things didn't quite go as planned.
A major criticism is that in places like the former USSR or China, which claimed to be building classless societies, there was little sign of the state withering away. Instead, the state apparatus often became more centralized and repressive than in many liberal democracies. Society seemed to develop new forms of hierarchy and power structures rather than moving towards classlessness.
Jelis's book, The New Class, is particularly relevant here, isn't it? He was an insider.
Yes. Jelis, a former Yugoslav communist, famously argued that in these socialist states, a new privileged class emerged, composed of those holding senior positions in the state administration and the Communist Party. They effectively became a dominant class, controlling the means of production and political power, despite the formal abolition of private property.
Wow.
This significantly challenged the idea that abolishing private property automatically leads to a classless society or the state withering away.
Some thinkers have labeled aspects of the theory utopian, despite Marx's claims otherwise.
Yes, despite Marx's claim to have developed scientific socialism, distinct from earlier utopian socialism, the vision of a perfectly cooperative, stateless, classless society is seen by many as unrealistic. Later historical developments, including widespread protest against the excesses and corruption of some socialist regimes, contributed to their eventual fall, further fueling these criticisms.
Are there recent attempts to revise the class theory in light of these criticisms? Adapt it.
Yes, some contemporary thinkers within the Marxist tradition are revising the theory. They find it more fruitful to look for different structures and forms of domination beyond just traditional economic class divisions, and to focus on challenging these various forms of power to work towards greater freedom, equality, and justice, rather than adhering strictly to the classical model of a rigid class structure and inevitable revolution leading to a stateless utopia.
The sources also touch on recent developments, often called neo-Marxism, which refine the relationship between the economic base and the political ideological superstructure. The state isn't just a simple reflection.
Classical Marxism saw the mode of production, the base, as fundamentally determining everything in the superstructure, the state, law, culture, ideology. This meant the state was seen primarily as a reflection of the base, an instrument of the dominant class, and wasn't typically considered worthy of independent, detailed analysis beyond that function. As the Communist Manifesto put it, the state executive is a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie.
And Marx and Engels didn't fully explain how the dominant class actually controlled the state apparatus, the mechanism.
Exactly. This lack of detail and the strong economic determinism were challenged, notably by liberal thinker Max Weber, who argued for the autonomy of state power. The state had its own power.
How did Weber argue the state had its own independent sources of power?
He pointed to two main things: the state's unique claim to a monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force, police, military, a power not available to private interests, and its strong organizational capacity through a developed bureaucracy capable of formulating, implementing, and monitoring policies independently.
Okay.
He argued that state power with these resources could not be simply reduced to an instrument dictated by economic class interests.
And neo-Marxists incorporated some of these ideas. They had to respond.
Yes, they sought to redefine the base-superstructure relationship. Thinkers like Antonio Gramsci and Nikos Poulantzas conceded the concept of relative autonomy for the superstructure, particularly the state, in capitalist society. Louis Althusser emphasized the interdependence of base and superstructure.
Antonio Gramsci is cited as one of the first in the Marxist tradition to concede this relative autonomy. How did he see it?
He made a key distinction between two levels of the superstructure: political society, the state, relying on force and coercion for direct domination through government and law, and civil society.
Civil society being things like families, schools, churches, media, the cultural stuff.
Yes, exactly. He saw civil society as closer to the base and relying on consent for domination, or what he called hegemony. These institutions socialized individuals, familiarized them with behavioral rules, and subtly encouraged deference to the ruling class's authority, building a web of beliefs and social relations that legitimize bourgeois rule and prevent its direct challenge.
So consent is manufactured through culture.
Largely, yes. Gramsci argued that the stability of capitalist society depends heavily on the efficiency of civil society in generating consent. Political society, coercion, is primarily used when civil society fails to contain dissent.
This leads to the debate between Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas on this relative autonomy. They didn't agree.
They had conflicting views within neo-Marxism, yeah. Miliband, in The State in Capitalist Society, represented an instrumentalist theory, arguing the state is invariably an instrument of class power.
Okay, closer to Marx.
Yeah, he explained this by pointing to the similar upper-middle-class backgrounds of state officials, the overwhelming economic power of the capitalist class, and the self-interest of politicians and bureaucrats in maintaining the existing system. He stayed closer to the classical position.
And Poulantzas offered a structuralist theory. What was that?
Yes, in Political Power and Social Classes, he drew a sharper distinction between the capitalist class's position and state power, conceding the state's relative autonomy. He argued that class domination isn't automatically translated into state power, and the state can't be seen as simply an instrument of a class. He saw the state as potentially enhancing its legitimacy by appearing to stand for the people, and even argued the capitalist class benefits from the state being relatively autonomous, as it can dissociate itself from direct state repression and better manage the economy for long-term capitalist interests.
So Poulantzas saw the state itself as an arena of class struggle, not just a tool controlled by one side.
Exactly. That's a key difference from Miliband's more classical instrument view. However, the sources note a critique that this emphasis on state autonomy, separating it significantly from direct control by the dominant class, might depart too much from the core tenets of original Marxism.
That's a comprehensive look at the class perspective. Seeing the state fundamentally as a tool of power imposed by a dominant class, with a historical vision of moving towards a stateless society, and the evolution of these ideas in response to critiques and changing realities. Very different indeed.
It offers a powerful counter-narrative to both the organic and liberal views, seeing the state not as a natural good or a neutral mechanism, but as an embodiment of power imbalances and exploitation.
We've now explored three major historical perspectives on the state. The organic theory, seeing it as a natural, potentially hierarchical body. The liberal view, seeing it as an artificial machine for individual benefit, evolving towards welfare. And the class perspective, seeing it as an instrument of dominant power. But our sources remind us that these aren't the only ways to understand the state. There's more.
That's right. Other important perspectives have emerged or gained prominence, offering different lenses, often critiquing or supplementing these more traditional views.
Let's look at the communitarian perspective first. This is more recent.
This is a more recent line of thought, yeah. It emerged partly as a critique of modern liberalism, particularly its strong emphasis on individualism. It challenges the liberal idea of the unencumbered self.
The unencumbered self. Meaning?
The notion of the individual as completely detached from pre-given social roles prior to their ends, free to choose their values and identity in isolation. Sort of a free-floating atom.
Instead, communitarians propose the idea of the situated self. What's that?
Yes, the core idea is that our identity, values, and even our sense of self are fundamentally constituted by our social roles, practices, shared history, and commitments within a specific community. We are embedded.
How does this contrast with the liberal focus on individual liberty, interests, and rights? It sounds like a shift in focus.
Communitarianism shifts the focus from the individual to the community, the common good, and social roles and obligations. It argues that individuality and freedom don't arise in a vacuum, but owe their origin and development to the framework and relationships provided by a well-functioning community.
Right.
They critique liberalism for being too focused on negative liberty and individual rights, arguing it doesn't sufficiently appreciate the need for individuals to have a place and participate in a vibrant community for true human flourishing.
And they draw a distinction between community and association, association being more liberal.
Yes. While liberals might see society as primarily an association, a contractual, impersonal arrangement of individuals pursuing their own interests, communitarians see community as something richer. It implies a shared spirit, a sense of belonging, intimate, durable relationships. By equating society more closely with community, they define social obligations as arising not just from voluntary contract, but from our very identity being shaped by our communal ties. They believe full personality development requires commitment to the community spirit.
They also see a different role for the political structure concerning defining what is good. How so?
Liberalism tends to say the political structure should provide a framework of right, justice, procedures, within which individuals are free to pursue their own conception of the good life. Communitarians argue the political structure does have a role in defining and fostering a conception of the good life for the community, and in helping citizens cultivate the virtues necessary to pursue that good.
And the common good is not just the sum total of individual goods, like in utilitarianism.
No, they see it as something shared, a uniform entity where individual goods converge through participation in communal life. Government, in this view, should strive to create and maintain a well-functioning community that enables this good life through active citizenship and shared purpose. Like many liberal thinkers, though, they generally subscribe to democratic government.
The emphasis is strongly on the idea that individual identity, talents, and pursuits only develop fully as a member of a community sharing in its corporate life. You need the group.
Yes. And this leads them to argue that political life should give more weight to community rights and the common good, rather than solely focusing on individual rights in isolation.
Alistair MacIntyre is a very prominent communitarian thinker, particularly known for his work After Virtue. What's his main point?
MacIntyre offers a strong critique of modern liberal individualism, ridiculing the idea of the autonomous moral agent who is supposedly disconnected from any social fabric or tradition. He argues that individuals can only truly flourish and achieve moral excellence within socially established cooperative human activity within practices and traditions.
Okay.
He suggests the state must actively promote and protect these forms of communal life and encourage human excellence. If the state treats individuals as fundamentally disconnected and just protects their abstract rights without fostering community, it leads, in his view, to moral chaos.
He even sketches out a vision of a utopian communitarian society with specific features like...
Yes, the sources list details like relying on local amateur officials, having a constrained market economy, an open civil service, independent public schools, a blending of work and free time, strong protection for religious and familial life, public honoring and dishonoring based on virtue rather than rank or class, workers' control in industry, and a politics based on robust debate among parties and movements. Quite detailed.
Charles Taylor's another key voice in this perspective. Similar ideas.
Yes, his philosophical papers echo MacIntyre's critique of liberalism's focus on individuals as purely autonomous choosers. He rejects the atomistic view that emphasizes only the individual will, arguing that genuine human development requires acknowledging our situatedness, our embeddedness in society, and our relationships.
Right.
Some feminist and religious writers also support aspects of this view, arguing that real human communities aren't simply built from aggregates of freely choosing adults, but involve inherent relationships and obligations.
What are the main difficulties or criticisms raised against communitarianism? It sounds appealing, but are there problems?
While the perspective offers a powerful ethical critique of some aspects of liberalism and emphasizes valuable aspects of social life, critics point out that it often lacks a clear, robust political philosophy. It provides a strong moral basis for valuing community, but struggles to define a practical political mechanism to ensure its principles are adopted as general rules or to address potential conflicts between community norms and individual liberty or minority rights within that community. How do you enforce the good?
Yeah. Tricky. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the post-colonial perspective. This isn't a theory of the state itself, but a lens.
Exactly. This perspective doesn't necessarily present a completely new theory of the state in the abstract sense, but it provides crucial insights and analysis into the nature and problems of states, particularly those in the developing world that are often missing from traditional Western theories.
It specifically analyzes the challenges of newly independent nations against the backdrop of their historical relations with colonial and ongoing relations with neocolonial powers.
Exactly. It's rooted in the lived experience of societies that gained independence in the mid-20th century and later, aspiring to develop and overcome historical disadvantages. It poses fundamental questions. Why were these societies underdeveloped and vulnerable to subjugation? Why, even after independence, do they struggle with development? What are the real challenges they face, and how can they be addressed?
The sources define colonial powers as Western countries that dominated and exploited regions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Pretty clear.
Yes, typically from the 18th to early 20th centuries, establishing political control primarily to facilitate economic exploitation. Neo-colonial powers are defined as developed Western countries that continue to exert influence and extract resources, often through economic means.
Like trade deals, conditional aid, multinational corporations.
Right, or sometimes through military intervention or cultural domination, even transferring pollution. The exploitation continues, just in different forms.
The historical pattern described is how Western European countries, after consolidating nationally and industrializing, needed resources and markets, and then preyed on areas rich in resources and labor, but lacking modern organization or unity.
Right. Enterprising individuals and companies from the West established political domination over these regions to secure and maximize their exploitation. They set up administrative structures and actively promoted their own culture and values as superior, often framed as a civilizing mission or the white man's burden, explicitly claiming racial superiority.
And making these claims convincingly so the colonized people might even buy into it.
Often, yes. These claims were presented so convincingly that they could even be internalized by segments of the colonized population.
The sources acknowledge that colonial rule sometimes introduced modern education, industry, infrastructure, and administrative structures, but emphasized the motivation wasn't benevolent.
Crucially, no. These measures were deliberately designed to facilitate and stabilize colonial rule and exploitation, not primarily for the benefit of the colonized populations. The famous example of Macaulay's 1835 Minute on Indian Education aimed to create a class of Indians who were Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, essentially creating brown white men who would help administer the colony.
Okay.
Railways and other infrastructure in India were built primarily to move troops, raw materials, and manufactured goods for British benefit, not Indian development per se.
Yet these structures unintentionally sowed the seeds of change, didn't they?
They did. Exposure to modern education, administration, and communication could foster awareness, consciousness, critical thinking among the colonized elite. It could help remove lethargy, challenge superstitions, spark a desire for social reform.
Right.
Often, this combined with a revival and idealization of past national glory and a sense of injustice, leading to nationalist movements and struggles for independence.
And when colonial powers could no longer contain these movements, they handed over power, often to local elites they'd trained.
Yes, often hoping these elites, trained in colonial ways, would be sympathetic and facilitate continued influence after formal independence, which also became increasingly costly to maintain militarily. So independence was sometimes granted as a shift towards neo-colonial forms of exploitation.
The persistence of colonial values and models after independence is a key point in this perspective. The mindset lingers.
Political independence didn't magically erase decades or centuries of cultural and administrative conditioning. Adherence to colonial structures, values, even ways of thinking persisted and often became interwoven with global culture through globalization.
The new nations, often called the Third World, faced immense challenges in nation building and state building. Two huge tasks.
Gigantic tasks indeed. Many weren't historically unified nations, but rather artificial territorial divisions drawn by colonial powers for administrative convenience. Their large size, vast populations, incredible cultural, linguistic, religious diversity. It made the tasks of creating a unified national identity and a functioning state apparatus incredibly difficult.
Nation building is about creating a sense of common identity and loyalty, overcoming those divisions.
Yes, shifting primary allegiance from smaller groups, tribes, villages, regions, castes to the larger central political system, fostering a sense of community, national identification, and solidarity that cuts across diverse loyalties.
And state building is creating the actual institutions of governance across the whole territory.
Developing a common, effective power center capable of establishing law and order, collecting taxes, providing defense, extending administrative and welfare services consistently throughout the territory. These tasks are complementary, really.
How so?
Well, effective state services can foster national allegiance, and stronger national allegiance makes state building easier. They reinforce each other.
Nation-building attempts involve national symbols, heroes, but sometimes glorify mythology, which can create problems in diverse societies, right?
Yes, requiring a strong commitment to secular values in pluralistic countries. And perhaps most importantly, genuine nation building depends on tackling fundamental socioeconomic problems like mass poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, ill health. Without addressing these basic needs, abstract national symbols mean little.
The process was often started by charismatic national leaders during independence struggles, figures who inspired hope.
Leaders of high caliber who mobilized masses, fostered unity, raised hopes for a new era where the post-colonial state would meet the needs and aspirations of its people.
But the reality often fell short of those hopes.
Tragically, yes, in many cases. Independence often led to a multiplication of demands. The inherited state bureaucracy, often trained under colonial rule for oppression, was difficult to transform into a sympathetic service provider. The disappearance of the founding stalwarts sometimes left a leadership vacuum, with new political elites prioritizing narrow interests and power struggles over nation building.
While there has been deterioration in many areas, it's also important to note the rise of new generations of brilliant, non-political professional elites who have contributed significantly to economic prosperity and raised awareness of democratic rights and social justice needs. It's not a simple story.
So the post-colonial perspective highlights how the state's nature, challenges, and limitations in much of the world are profoundly shaped by this specific history of external domination and the ongoing struggle for genuine self-determination and development. It adds necessary context.
It adds a crucial layer of historical and global context to understanding the state,
Mhm.
moving beyond frameworks developed solely in the Western experience.
Next, let's explore the Gandhian perspective, which offers a distinctly moral critique of the state, based on Gandhi's thought.
This perspective is rooted in the social and political thought of Mahatma Gandhi, yes. At its heart is the principle of nonviolence, ahimsa, and a deep skepticism towards coercion.
And the state, by its very nature, relies on power, law, and ultimately coercion. That's the problem for Gandhi. That's his view. Gandhi saw the state as necessarily embodying violence and imposing its will on individuals through its apparatus of police, courts, prisons, military. He believed this inherent coercion suppressed individuality, forced people into a uniform mold, destroyed self-reliance, stunted personality, deprived freedom, and ultimately obstructed the moral progress of human society.
He saw the modern state as particularly problematic due to its increased power and centralization. More dangerous.
Yes, he felt power concentrated in the hands of a few was easily misused. He described the state as a soulless machine that acts based on impersonal rules and structures, often devoid of genuine human sensitivity or moral responsibility. Those enforcing rules don't feel the moral weight.
So his critique of political power was primarily moral, not economic like Marx.
Crucially, yes, it wasn't based on historical materialism or economic analysis. He was convinced that if the principle of nonviolence could become universal in society, political power and the state would become redundant, leading to a state of enlightened anarchy.
Enlightened anarchy. What did he mean by that? Sounds paradoxical.
He envisioned a society where every individual was their own ruler, perfectly self-controlled and self-disciplined, acting morally without external compulsion and without hindering their neighbors. He said, political power is not an end, but one of the means. If national life becomes so perfect as to become self-regulated, no representation becomes necessary. There is then a state of enlightened anarchy.
An ideal state with no political power, no state at all. Pure self-regulation.
Yes, that was the ideal vision. While acknowledging this ideal might never be fully realized in practice, he echoed thinkers like Thoreau in believing that government is best which governs the least.
He was influenced by the philosophical anarchist Leo Tolstoy, right?
Yes, both Tolstoy and Gandhi shared a deep commitment to nonviolence, prioritized spiritual and moral well-being over material satisfaction, and were critical of private property as a source of exploitation. They also differed from many other anarchists by valuing religion as a positive moralizing force, though drawing on different religious traditions.
The sources make an interesting comparison between Gandhi and Marx. Both believed in a classless and stateless society, but reached that conclusion via very different paths.
It's a key comparison. Marx saw classes as based on ownership of the means of production, aiming for a classless society through violent revolution, compulsory labor, and the eventual withering away of the state, seen as a class instrument, after full technological development. He viewed religion as an opium to be eliminated.
And Gandhi's path to a classless, stateless society was through moral and spiritual transformation, not violence.
For Gandhi, class distinction was more about a mental outlook that devalued physical labor. His key to a classless society was recognizing the dignity of labor, particularly physical labor, prescribing bread labor, mandatory physical work for everyone, even intellectuals, as a productive function performed in a spirit of service.
Right. And trusteeship.
And the principle of trusteeship for wealth and industry, where capitalists would have a change of heart and regard their possessions not as private property, but as a trust to be managed for the benefit of society.
So change of heart instead of violent class struggle. A very different mechanism.
Exactly. He also saw the state as an instrument of the dominant class, but wanted it to become redundant in a classless society, not through a revolution, but through the moral elevation and self-sufficiency of individuals and communities. He favored replacing large-scale machinery with human labor to provide jobs and limit needs, emphasizing the elevation of human character so that external force becomes unnecessary. And he saw religion as a vital moralizing force.
Marx professed scientific socialism based on historical and economic analysis, while Gandhi professed moral individualism. What's that?
Yes, Gandhi's core principle of moral individualism held the individual as an end in itself, possessing inherent dignity. No human should be treated as a mere means to a larger end, and no worldly possession is more valuable than a human being. Individuals should accept obligations only at their own free will, guided by their conscience.
Gandhi's concept of Swaraj seems to embody this moral individualism. It means more than just independence.
Swaraj literally means self-rule or self-government. While it became the popular slogan for India's independence struggle against British rule, Gandhi gave it a much deeper and broader meaning.
It wasn't just political independence from foreign rule, it was internal too.
No, it was also cultural and moral independence, having confidence in one's own potential, one's own culture, making one's own decisions without blindly imitating others. His vision of Swaraj was a system where people had a natural affinity with their country and readily collaborated, but crucially, it also ruled out dependence on government, even one's own.
He said, self-government means continuous effort to be independent of government control. Swaraj government will be a sorry affair if people look up to it for the regulation of every detail of life. People needed to be self-reliant.
His vision of true democracy was not just electing representatives, but people being capable of regulating and controlling authority themselves, capable of resisting abuse of authority. As he put it, real Swaraj will come not by the acquisition of authority by a few, but by the acquisition of the capacity by all to resist authority when it is abused. Educating the masses to this sense of individual and collective capacity was key.
And this idea wasn't confined to a political goal. It implied the moral regeneration of the individual, self-improvement.
Absolutely. Swaraj meant self-control, self-discipline, self-purification at the individual level, a process that had to continue after independence. He famously said, "I am not interested in freeing India merely from the English yoke. I am bent upon freeing India from any yoke whatsoever," seeing the Swaraj movement as fundamentally a self-purification movement.
So individual self-government through self-control was as important as political self-government, achieved by the same means, reliance on nonviolence.
It's a perspective deeply rooted in moral and spiritual principles, offering a vision of minimal state power achieved through individual and societal moral transformation, rather than political or economic restructuring alone.
Next up, the feminist perspective, which brings a critical lens to power and the state, specifically focusing on gender.
Feminist perspectives are concerned with two key aspects of the state: how it regulates the public sphere, and how it functions as an instrument of power, particularly as it relates to gender.
Regarding regulation, they argue that male dominance isn't confined to the public world of politics or work, but extends to private, intimate relations. The personal is political.
Yes. And securing justice for women requires acknowledging and addressing power imbalances not just in the traditional public sphere, but also in seemingly purely personal relations like those within the family. This led to that famous feminist slogan, "The personal is political," redefining what counts as political.
All right.
Kate Millett, in Sexual Politics, is quoted redefining politics broadly as power-structured relationships, arrangements whereby one group of persons is controlled by another, arguing that dynamics of power and domination are at play even in areas like romantic relationships, not just economics or government.
Women have historically been a deprived section of the public sphere and politics, denied rights.
Absolutely, for centuries, widely denied fundamental rights like property ownership and the right to vote. From this perspective, the state becomes a key arena and instrument for meeting women's demands, seeking protection from male violence, fighting for reproductive rights, advocating for changes in family and employment law, pushing for pensions and welfare schemes that address women's specific needs and historical disadvantages.
And they critically analyze the state itself as an instrument where male power is embedded. It's not neutral.
No. Demonstrating how patriarchal power structures are built into the state apparatus, its laws, and its policy outcomes, often implicitly serving male interests. Zilla Eisenstein, a feminist theorist, critiqued the liberal state for presenting itself as fully autonomous, neutral positions open to all.
but ignoring the reality.
Right. Ignoring the fact that women are often denied an actual share of power within that structure, regardless of formal equality.
Socialist feminists add further critiques, linking gender and class under capitalism.
How? They argue that state welfare policies, while seemingly beneficial, can sometimes increase women's dependence on men within the capitalist system. They also point out how the state, in a capitalist system, might facilitate freeing up women's labor for market exploitation, while simultaneously relying on and reinforcing women's unpaid labor in the home, which serves men's interests by providing essential domestic work for free.
Women in post-colonial states also face specific challenges from this perspective, layered disadvantages.
They are often among the most deprived globally, with their lives least touched by state welfare services due to poor implementation and resource limitations. They can also be disproportionately victims of state violence or neglect. In formerly socialist states, the state was sometimes associated with forced emancipation, pushing women into strenuous industrial jobs that weren't necessarily suited to them or truly liberated them.
And the widespread exclusion of women from state power is seen as having wider implications for society as a whole, not just for women.
Yes, beyond just fairness, the perspective suggests this exclusion has contributed to negative outcomes like environmental degradation, arguing women are often more nature-friendly than men. It also points out how men's cultural pride in warfare and military strength, contrasted with women often seen as more peace-loving, contributes to states building their power on military might, leading to mounting international tension and hindering cooperation on issues vital for all of humanity.
An essential perspective that highlights how power structures, often gendered and deeply ingrained in social relations, are replicated within the state apparatus itself and significantly influence its priorities and actions.
It compels us to see the state not as a gender-neutral entity, but one shaped by historical and ongoing gendered power dynamics, with real consequences for half the population.
Finally, let's look at the pluralist perspective. This sees the state more like a referee.
Pluralism offers a view of the state primarily as a mechanism that serves the interests of various competing groups within society simultaneously. It functions as both a description of how democratic states actually work and a normative ideal for how they should operate to rectify undue influence by powerful sections.
A key characteristic of pluralism is its rejection of a single, concentrated center of power. Power is spread out.
Absolutely. Unlike theories that see power residing solely with the state or with a single class or embodied in an organism, pluralism argues that power in a democratic society is widely dispersed among multiple centers. The state itself is seen not as holding supreme unchecked power, but as one actor, albeit a very important one, within a system of competing power centers.
And the state's role is seen as that of an impartial arbitrator, managing the competition.
Yes. The state must act as a neutral referee, impartially balancing and reconciling the competing claims and interests of various social groups vying for scarce resources or political influence. Its authority, in this view, is legitimate only insofar as it acts as a guardian of justice and facilitates this balancing process.
This perspective emphasizes the importance of the right to freedom of association. Groups need to be able to form.
Crucially, a pluralist system depends on a democratic state that guarantees the right for individuals to form independent associations based on shared interests, whether they are economic groups like trade unions or business associations, social groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, issue-oriented groups.
Right.
These associations become power centers in themselves, strong enough to articulate their interests and counterbalance the power of the state and other groups.
These independent associations make up what's often called civil society.
Yes. Civil society, seen as the realm of these independent associations pursuing their members' interests and contributing to the community's larger well-being, is considered a vital bulwark of democratic order in the contemporary world, providing checks and balances against state power.
In contrast, authoritarian states don't allow such independent associations, or they control them.
And pluralist theory suggests that if strong independent associations do manage to emerge and gain power in an authoritarian context, they are likely catalysts for challenging and potentially overthrowing the authoritarian regime, leading towards democracy. The sources mention examples like the Solidarity trade union movement in Poland in the 1980s, or environmental groups in Eastern Europe contributing to the collapse of regimes.
The pluralist movement itself originated as a protest against the doctrine of absolute state sovereignty in the early 20th century.
Thinkers like Léon Duguet in France contested the idea that sovereignty resided solely and supremely with the state, Early British pluralists, including Harold Laski in his earlier phase, and Robert McIlver, made passionate arguments for recognizing social groups as legitimate centers of power, arguing the state had to compete for the loyalty of individuals by effectively serving their interests, often expressed through these groups.
Contemporary pluralism appears in a somewhat different form, more descriptive.
Yes, landmarks in this contemporary view include works by political scientists like Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom, such as Politics, Economics, and Welfare, and Dahl's A Preface to Democratic Theory and Who Governs.
What were their key findings about democratic society? How does it actually work, according to them?
They observed that in working democracies, political resources and influence are typically widely distributed, not concentrated in one place or one class. Different interest groups tend to prevail in different policy disputes and at different times. It's a constant negotiation.
They developed a model for this working democracy called polyarchy.
Yes. Dahl and Lindblom's term polyarchy describes a system where power isn't centralized, but dispersed among numerous competing interests and groups. The role of the government in a polyarchy is largely that of an honest broker, facilitating negotiation and compromise among these competing groups. And Polsby, building on this, even suggested that in such a situation, at the bottom, nobody really dominates.
So the descriptive claim is that power is fragmented and dispersed among competing groups, with the state as an arena and arbiter. Sounds fairly balanced.
That's the core descriptive claim. However, like other theories, pluralism faces significant criticisms. It's not always that simple.
One key criticism is that the concept implies groups bargain on an equal footing, which isn't how it works in practice, is it? Some groups have way more power.
Exactly. Critics argue that the pluralist model often masks underlying inequalities in power and resources between groups. Some groups, like large corporations or wealthy donors, possess significantly more resources, money, organization, access, than others, giving them undue influence. The playing field isn't level.
And some groups may lack internal democracy themselves.
Yes, allowing dominant personalities or small leadership cliques to project their own will and interests rather than genuinely representing the interests of their members, further undermining the idea of equitable competition.
Even later exponents of pluralism conceded these points, didn't they? Softened their claims.
Charles Lindblom, in his later work Politics and Markets, acknowledged that business and property interests often hold a privileged position in market-dominated polyarchies, effectively exercising undemocratic control due to their economic power. Robert Dahl, too, in Dilemmas of Pluralist Democracy, conceded that pluralism in practice is not always an open competition between truly equal forces.
This recognition led Dahl to bring the normative side back to the forefront, advocating for change.
Yes. He recommended policies explicitly aimed at promoting the redistribution of power and resources to reduce inequalities and make the pluralist competition more genuinely equitable. This brought the descriptive and normative aspects of pluralism closer together, acknowledging the reality of unequal power while advocating for changes to make the system live up to its ideal.
The merit of pluralism, like other liberal theories, is its contribution to the development of constitutional government and procedures, checks and balances.
Yes, it reinforces the idea of checks and balances and the importance of civil liberties like freedom of association. However, the sources note its tragedy, much like other liberal theories, lies in its frequent invocation to justify the capitalist system, despite capitalism's inherent contradictions of dominance and dependence, which persist even with welfare policies.
Suggesting that achieving true social justice might require more than just managing the competition between groups within the existing economic system. Maybe deeper changes are needed.
It offers a valuable lens for seeing power distributed among competing groups, yeah. But it must grapple with the reality that the playing field for that competition is often far from level.
Wow, that was a tremendous amount of ground covered in this deep dive. Seriously, a world tour of state theories.
We've unpacked such diverse ways of seeing the state, haven't we? From an ancient organism where individuals find worth in the whole, to an artificial machine built by human contract for limited purposes, to a fundamental instrument of class power and exploitation.
And we've gone beyond those historical binaries to explore perspectives shaped by community, the enduring legacy of colonial history and power dynamics, moral and spiritual principles, gender, and the complex competition between different social groups in modern society.
Each perspective offers unique and valuable insights into different facets of the state, power, and how society is organized. But, as we've seen, drawn from the sources, each also faces significant criticisms and highlights its own blind spots or limitations when applied to the complexities of the real world.
These aren't just abstract ideas from history books or philosophical tests, are they? They underpin the laws, the policies, the power dynamics, the debates that structure society and government today, directly affecting your daily life.
Absolutely.
Understanding these different lenses, their core arguments, their weaknesses, it's truly a shortcut to being well-informed about the fundamental forces at play in the world around you.
It helps you see why different people have such radically different ideas about what the state is and what it should do and where those ideas come from. It explains a lot of our current disagreements.
So considering all these varied and sometimes conflicting perspectives, the state as a natural body, a rational tool, a class instrument, a necessary evil, a potentially oppressive structure, a means of liberation, a unifier of groups, a product of history and power dynamics. Is the state primarily a necessary protector, an unavoidable oppressor, a flawed but perfectible instrument, or maybe something else entirely?
How do you see the state's role in your life and the world today, now armed with these different viewpoints? This deep dive, hopefully, gives you the tools to think more critically about that question.
This deep dive is just the beginning of that exploration.